بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another episode of the series on Al-Qawa'id Al-Fiqhiyya, Islamic legal maxims. The one that we'll look at today has been proposed by some scholars as being a sixth leading maxim, in addition to the normal five that are more famously accepted as being major maxims by all the schools of thought. That's probably a debatable point, but at any rate, the claim has been made that this maxim has a greater status than many of the other independent maxims. And in Arabic, the phrasing is إعمال الكلام أولى من إهماله, which is translated as giving effect to words is preferable to giving them no effect. So this is then relevant to all the text of the Sharia, and it's also relevant to what people say orally, what they write down, and it's a guideline for the method of interpreting people's speech. The word kalam means speech, statements or words, and i'mal means to employ, use, put into operation, or bring to bear. So i'malul kalam means to construe a word or phrase as having a meaning consistent with its linguistic implications. The other key word in the maxim is ihmal, which means to neglect, disregard, ignore. So ihmal al-kalam means to construe a word or phrase as having no meaning or practical implication in a given text. So what this maxim is saying is that it's not allowed to completely disregard words in a written or oral discourse. The starting assumption is that words are used according to their literal meaning, which is literal is referred to in Arabic as haqiqi. So al-ma'na al-haqiqi, the literal meaning. And there's another legal maxim which states al-aslu fil kalam al-haqiqa. The starting rule with regard to speech is that it is literal. Now, the scholars of the language and the scholars of usul al-fiqh, they've gone quite deep into examining, well, what does it mean, the literal meaning of a word. And for sure, one of the aspects of the literal meaning is the meaning assigned to it originally in the language. Now, this definition has been challenged, most notably by Ibn Taymiyyah. He said, were you around when the language was started? How do you know what the original meaning of the word was? Nobody was around to witness it. So a statement like that, or a definition that uses those terms, is going beyond the limits of reasonability, and so it should be rejected. And that's partially accurate, but there's also a way of refuting it in the sense that when you have a tag for something that you can point at, it is reasonable to assume that that's the original meaning. And when you look at one of the really interesting things that anthropologists have done and linguists is studying pidgin languages. I was reading about the kind of pidgin that's used in New Guinea. New Guinea has about 200 separate languages because it's a mountainous country and little tribes comprised of relatively few people live in these little mountain valleys. And so you had all these different languages, hundreds of different tribal languages. And then I guess it was the British came and colonized the place. And so those natives who were interacting with the British they were also interacting with other natives that didn't necessarily understand each other. So what happened is that this language developed that allowed everybody to communicate with each other, and it's mixed between certain English words that are pronounced as the native people were able to pronounce them, and certain words from various tribal languages that also became part of the vocabulary. And one of the interesting things about this language is that it only has two prepositions. Because prepositions you can't point to, in, on, to, from. You can't point to something and say in. You can point to something and say man, woman, child, dog. But how do you point to in, on? It's a much more complicated, abstract concept. So when you have words that mean something that you can point at, it's reasonable to say that's the literal meaning. And then if you have some other abstract meaning associated with that same word, then that would be a derived meaning. So derived meanings can also be considered literal if everybody understands them to mean the same thing. So one of the classic examples that's always mentioned in this context is the Arabic word gha'it. Gha'it, literally, what it means is some place that is low-lying, like a basin, a part of the earth that maybe has some kind of rising up, like a bowl-shaped depression in the earth. And in the early days, as the language was developing, even into the Islamic era, people didn't have toilets. They didn't even have outhouses, some of them. There were some, but frequently people would go out into the desert to relieve themselves. So when doing that, people would prefer to conceal themselves from other people seeing them. So the kind of places that people would choose to relieve themselves would be these kind of low-lying areas with a little bit of rising up of the ground around them that would provide them with some kind of cover. And so because people would choose those locations to do their business on a regular basis, then the word for excrement became gha'it. People began to use that word for a low-lying part of the earth and apply it to what it was that would end up being in those low-lying parts of the earth. And it got to the point where if somebody used the word gha'it, the first thing that the listener would think of, unless the context was very unusual, was human excrement. Now, there are also terms which have meaning in a given context, or let's say within a subculture. A word like gha'it, all the Arabs understood it to mean a certain thing, which was not its original meaning. There are certain words that have a special meaning to a given group of people. And a classic example of that is the term marfu'. Marfu', literally, linguistically, it means raised up. And what it means if you're a grammarian and you're talking to other grammarians, marfu' means a noun in the nominative case. If you're a hadith scholar and you use the term with another hadith scholar, then what you're talking about is a narration that is attributed to as originating with the Prophet ﷺ. In English, we have the example of the word put. Normally it means to place something. That's the linguistic meaning. If you're a stockbroker, you're buying and selling securities, a put means a contract in which the seller has an option to sell a security at a certain price at a fixed future date. If you're an athlete, then putting a shot put means that you're tossing this round metal ball. So given a different group of people, the same word will have a different meaning, and the literal meaning in any given context is the first thing that the listener would think of when he hears the word in that context. It should also be mentioned that there is such a thing as the Sharia meanings of words. There are all kinds of words that had some kind of linguistic meaning in the language, and then Islam came along and it used those terms with usually a more specialized meaning. So salat generally meant prayer, and then when Islam came, it meant that kind of prayer that has the format that we're familiar with. Let's take a break and come back.
A friendly message by Dr. Zakir. Old Age Home.
Al-Quran, Surah Al-Isra, chapter number 17, verses number 23 and 24 says, "Your Lord has decreed that you worship none but Him, and that you be kind to parents. Whether one or both of them attain old age in your life, say not a word of contempt. Do not say off to them, nor repel them, but address them in terms of honor. And out of kindness, lower to them the wing of humility and say, My Lord, bestow on them your mercy, even as they cherished me in childhood." There is no place for old age home in Islam.
Peace TV, the solution for humanity.
The value of money in the hereafter will be measured by its proper use in the present.
يا أيها الذين آمنوا أنفقوا مما رزقناكم من قبل أن يأتي يوم لا بيع فيه ولا خلة ولا شفاعة.
According to the glorious Quran, one of the best ways to use your money is to spend it in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by spreading His message of Islam. Peace TV is a non-profit Islamic satellite television channel that is primarily dedicated for just that cause, the proper presentation of Islam. It's a great choice to invest in it and a golden opportunity to purify your wealth in a way that pleases Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Support Peace TV. Send your zakat and donations to IRFI Al Ryan Bank, 47 Calthorpe Road, Birmingham, UK, B151TH. Pound account number 011-32301. IBAN GB49ARAY 30008301 132301. Sort code 300083. Swift BIC code ARAY GB22. Please confirm your contribution at support@peacetv.tv.
Support Peace TV, the solution for humanity.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome back. So we're talking about the rules for interpreting people's statements, written and oral statements. And also this same rule applies to understanding Sharia texts. And we're talking about the concept that the basic rule is that texts and people's words should be interpreted literally. And we're exploring what does that mean, literally. There's the original assignment of meaning to a word in the language. And then there's also a transfer of meaning so that that word is universally understood to mean something. And it's the first thing now that people think of when they hear the word. And the original meaning is actually faded into the background. It's only used for that meaning in rare occasions. And then you have these various subgroups in a society or professions or academic specialties where they have their lingo. So in order to understand what they're saying, you have to understand what those words mean in that group of people. And we also said that the Sharia also has its literal meanings. So we mentioned the term salat. Salat, its original linguistic meaning was prayer, so supplication would be salat. But after Islam, the dominant meaning of salat in Sharia texts is those actions that involve takbir and standing and bowing and making sajda, etc. And every now and then there's an occasion where a reference will be made to salat according to that original linguistic meaning in a Sharia text. And in that case, that use of salat according to the original linguistic meaning is considered to be a figurative use of the word in the context of a Sharia text. An example of that with regard to the word saum, originally it just meant refrain, to refrain from something, refrain from anything. And after Islam, we understand saum and siyam to refer to refraining from food and drink and sexual relations from the crack of dawn until sunset. But in the Quran, Maryam, when she comes and she's carrying the infant baby Isa, and the people challenge her, what's going on here? She says, Inni nazartu lirrahmani sawma. I made a vow to Ar-Rahman, a vow for Sawm. And then she goes on to explain that I will not say a word to anybody. So what she meant there is refraining from speech. So those are various aspects of the literal meanings of words. If we look at, there's another whole dimension to the language, which is metaphorical meanings. Because people are always associating, people are endlessly creative. And one of the ways that people manifest their creativity is in their use of the language. And so that's what idioms are all about. One of the difficulties of learning a foreign language is that, you can learn what words mean by themselves from a dictionary, but the way that people use them may not be those dictionary meanings, and especially for phrases. So, English is, that's the language I'm most familiar of, the idioms of English. It's just tons and tons of idioms. For example, cut to the chase. What does that mean? If an Arab were learning English, he looks up each word. Cut, it means to use scissors or a knife. To, of course, we know what that means. Though, we know what that means. Chase means to pursue somebody. Well, what does that mean, Use scissors to pursue somebody. It doesn't mean anything. But, in contemporary American slang, it means get to the point. And why do you use those words for that meaning? It's because after the invention of VCRs, people would be watching movies, and some of the parts, especially like teenage boys, the kind of things that they want to watch are the car chase scenes and those other scenes where people are just talking or boring to them. And so people would say, cut to the chase. In other words, fast forward through this boring part and get to the good part. So that expression then came to mean get to the point. Somebody is beating around the bush. Now there's another expression. What does that mean, beating around the bush? It means, the literal meaning has nothing to do with the intended idiomatic meaning, which is that you're talking but you're not getting to the point. So the metaphorical use of language is extremely rich, and it's kind of amazing that somebody would deny that there's such a thing as metaphorical use of language. Those who deny it, like Ibn Taymiyyah, they said, well, these other usages, like cut to the chase, in that context, that's the literal meaning of cut to the chase. It's an exercise in a certain stubbornness in order to defend an ideological point. And it's a definite minority position among scholars of the Arabic language. Now, interpreting speech metaphorically is not allowed unless there is some kind of clues to indicate that the literal meaning is not intended. So, in an expression like cut to the chase, it's clear that cutting and chasing, they don't mean anything put together, and so there has to be some other meaning. An example in the Quran, فَلَمَّا سُقِطَ فِي أَيْدِيهِمْ وَرَأَوْا أَنَّهُمْ قَدْ ضَلُّوا. This is talking about the people of Musa when they took that statue. They made a statue of the golden calf. It says, فَلَمَّا سُقِطَ فِي أَيْدِيهِمْ وَرَأَوْا أَنَّهُمْ قَدْ ضَلُّوا. What is exactly, the literal meaning is that some unmentioned thing was made to fall into their hands. You know, the literal meaning of each of those words, when you put them into a phrase, that, you know, doesn't mean much. And so it's a metaphorical expression for realizing that, wait a minute, you know, this is, something's gone wrong here. So what this maxim is saying is that, okay, the first option in understanding speech is to understand it literally. And then, if there is some difficulty, there's some clues and indicators that make it difficult to understand the speech literally, then the next step is to understand it metaphorically. Why? Because the language allows for that. And if you don't resort to looking for metaphorical explanations, then what you're doing is saying it doesn't make sense literally, therefore it doesn't make sense at all. And so you're tossing out the meaning entirely. And the implications of that position is that this person who made that statement is just, you know, spouting random words and has no objective behind what they're saying. And that goes against the starting characteristic of people's actions. When they do something, they have an objective. If they're sane, they mean something, they intend something by their acts. So if they're saying something, they intend to convey a meaning. Now, in order for a person's speech to merit consideration, there are some qualifications like maturity. A child will sometimes talk nonsense and is not able to express himself properly and doesn't understand the meaning of the words the way he's using them. So maturity is one condition for applying this principle. Another is sanity. A person who is insane, their speech is incoherent. I mean, that's one of the features of that condition. Another is free choice. If a person makes a statement under coercion, then what he is saying is not what he means. There's all kinds of discussion about the implications of that between the Hanafis and the majority. The majority don't give any weight to a person who makes statements under any kind of coercion, whereas the Hanafis make a distinction. We won't go into that. So, in order to understand speech metaphorically, there has to be some plausible angle in the language by which it is to be understood. That meaning is actually there. That the language has to be used in that way for that meaning. And there also have to be concrete clues present that prevent the literal meaning from being understood. The Prophet ﷺ, he said there are three subjects in which serious statements are taken seriously and also statements made in jest: divorce, marriage, and a return to a married state after a revocable divorce. If a person said, I was only joking when I said that, it's like, you know, you should have found something else to joke about. Whatever you say on these subjects, you can't say later, I was only joking. No, when you say it, it's to be taken at face value. Now, an example of a situation where the Prophet ﷺ used a metaphorical statement and the Sahaba understood it literally, and then later they understood, oh, he didn't mean it literally. When he was in his final illness, his wives asked him, who will be the first to join you from among us? And he said, the one with the longest arms. أَطْوَلُ كُنَّ يَدًا. And so they all got together and they started measuring from the shoulder to the fingertips. And they discovered that Sauda was the one with physically the longest arm. And then after the Prophet ﷺ died, a couple of months later, Zainab, one of his wives, had two wives named Zainab, one of the Zainabs died. And she was famous for being very generous in spending in charity. And they said, oh, that's what he meant. So that's an indication of the existence of the use of metaphorical language in the Sunnah, and it's there in the Arabic language too. We've come to the end of our time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Wallahu a'lam.
إلهي أنت ربي ذو الجلال